Anthony, one of your book's chapter is dedicated to Israel's intelligence industry. You mention a series of spywares and private Israeli companies that made them. I'd like to hear you a little bit on it and also ask what's the relationship between these private companies like the NSO group and the Israeli state?
So in the last year, some people may have heard of the stories around Pegasus, which is a notorious Israeli spyware tool, which is put on your phone, whether it's Android or iPhone, Apple iPhone. And whoever's doing that, government official, police, intelligence service, can essentially get all the information from your phone, talking about photos, text messages, emails, even if you're using encrypted apps, Signal, WhatsApp, it makes no difference. They're totally irrelevant and useless if your phone has been compromised. All those messages can be seen. And Pegasus, or NSO Group, the Israeli company behind it, has been around for around 15 years. And they've sold to dozens and dozens and dozens of countries who don't even know the exact number, 80, 90 countries in the world, democracies and dictatorships. And these various countries have used this incredibly powerful tool to go after dissidents, journalists, critics. And one of the things I examine in the book, and in fact, one reason why I wrote the book, it wasn't the only reason, but it was a factor, was about 5 or 6 years ago, some people may remember there was a lot of international media attention, mostly in the US, but I'm sure it was also in Brazil, around Pegasus. Some good reporting detailing how Pegasus was now appearing in all these countries around the world. But the way that often that story was framed was, this is a rogue Israeli company doing terrible things. Oh my God, what are we going to do about it? Which completely missed the point of what was going on. Yes, it's a terrible company doing bad things, but it's essentially an arm of the Israeli state. And what I mean by that is, yes, it's a private company. It has a board. It has staff members. It's not controlled day to day by Netanyahu, the prime minister, not in a literal sense. But the way NSO Group and many of those so-called private Israeli arms companies, surveillance companies work is, they're willingly used by the state, by Israel, to further certain foreign policy goals. So I document in the book how in the last 10 years, we can see how Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, goes to places like Rwanda and India and Hungary. The list goes on and on and on, meeting with the leaders in those countries to talk about arms or trade or whatever it may be. And within 6 or 12 months after those meetings, Pegasus is suddenly being used in those nations. And it's very clear, and I showed a lot of evidence for this in the book, that NSO Group is being used almost by Netanyahu. And there are other companies. This is just the most famous. There are many other Israeli surveillance or spyware companies doing this kind of work, that it's being used by Netanyahu and Israel as a diplomatic carrot. In other words, they go to a country X, Rwanda, India, somewhere else, and they say, we will sell you this most unbelievably sophisticated spyware. You can use it against anyone you don't like, critics, opposition politicians, whoever. But in return, we would like you to, for example, vote in a certain way in the UN or do us certain favors. And I show in the book that there's a lot of evidence that, in fact, that's how this is operated. Now, it doesn't mean that because country X buys Pegasus, therefore they do everything Israel wants. That's not how it works. But the relationship becomes very close. And as I say in the book, over lots of other examples, not just Pegasus, the Israeli arms industry, in a way, has become a key insurance policy for Israel. And what I mean by that is that as more and more countries, and this was the case before October 7, and I would say even more since, as more and more countries around the world and people, citizens, civil society, NGOs, journalists, more and more of those groups become very critical of the Israeli occupation, its colonization of Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, and beyond. Israel needs to make friends to try to neuter some of that criticism. And the way they make friends, so to speak, is to sell insane amounts of weapons. And don't forget, Israel is a tiny country, very small population, and yet it's the 9th biggest arms dealer in the world. It's not number one. It's never going to be number one. America is number one, and other nations like France and Germany and Russia are high, and that'll probably continue for many years. But the global arms trade has never been bigger. In 2023, it was something like $2.3 trillion US. Now, Israel doesn't obviously, it's not involved in all of that. They're involved in some of it. As I said before, the latest figures were 13.1 billion. But Pegasus has become a key calling card for Israel over many, many years. So whenever we've seen in the last decade cases from, I mean, there's so many countries, from Greece to India, from Hungary to Rwanda, Pegasus being used by those governments, Israel and the company NSO Group are directly behind it, and they're using it to try to further Israeli foreign policy goals.
Okay, so Anthony, you just answered about Israeli private companies, NSO, and I wanted to ask you, I suppose you know that in January this year, there was a scandal in Brazil involving First Mile and Cognite. It was being used by the Brazilian intelligence agency to spy on oppositionists.
Yes.
And also the Brazilian army also had this tool, even though it lied about it, as we revealed in an article.
Right.
I'd like to ask you, what are the implications of using these tools for the sovereignty of the countries that use them, that acquire them? Because, of course, these tools exploit breaches in security systems, communication systems, and I suppose there is also breaches in the systems that use these tools.
The question of sovereignty is a really important one when it comes to Israeli spyware, because there's a few ways to explain more about that. There's a lot still we don't know about what information is kept by NSO Group, the company behind Pegasus, but as you rightly say, there are many, many other companies, and a lot of the coverage in the last years has, in my view, overly focused on Pegasus at the exclusion of many other companies, which were in the past smaller. Yes, they do exactly the same thing. And they're very happy, those Israeli companies, for Pegasus to get all the heat so they can keep on selling their tools to various countries around the world. The issue of sovereignty is important because my understanding is that it's very likely, I can't guarantee it, but it's very likely that when Israeli company X sells a surveillance tool to, say, Brazilian intelligence, it's quite likely that at various points the Israeli government could have access to that information. Now, I say that because in the last 2 years, there's been a long-standing legal case that Apple was trying to sue NSO Group. A lot of iPhone users had been spied on, essentially. I think it was about 1,400 people. Apple was upset. They took NSO Group to court. That's the long and the short of it. And in the end, just recently, which did not get much attention, that court case is now being dropped. Why is it being dropped? Because the whole process was, it made very clear the Israeli government was essentially working with NSO Group to make sure that no information about what NSO Group, what information they were keeping, what the relations were between Israeli government and those states. Now, I use that as an example to show, and the result of that was Apple essentially said to the court, this is pointless. Now, I'm disappointed Apple took that view. Not that Apple asked for my opinion, of course, but I'm disappointed that they did this because I think that it seems to almost acknowledge the problem. I mean, the point of this court case is to get past this problem. So this is a roundabout way to answer your question, which is there is a very good chance, again, I can't guarantee it, but a very good chance that many elements within Israeli intelligence has access with the acceptance of the Israeli surveillance company, of the information that that client is getting, which is then being able to be viewed by the Israeli company, Cognite, NSO Group, whoever it may be, and therefore potentially the Israeli government, because so many of these companies are staffed by former intelligence unit officers, and particularly Unit 8200, that's like the elite intelligence service akin to the America's NSA. And that should be pretty concerning for countries like Brazil. And it's interesting, you obviously know Brazilian politics much better than me, but it's interesting, and this reminds me of so many other countries, including Mexico, for example. It often doesn't matter who actually is in charge of a country. Now, I'm not suggesting that Brazilians don't care whether it's Bolsonaro or Lula. I'm not saying that. Obviously, they're very different people. Of course they are. And that's obviously up to the Brazilians to decide who they want, for example. But sadly, I've seen in country after country after country, even if initially the use of these Israeli spyware tools started off with the right-wing governments, it often continues just the same with left-wing ones. Left-wing governments, intelligence services, police forces. And what that shows is that the reason why there's basically no global regulation on these tools is because countries are obsessed with them. They have no interest in regulating them. They have no interest in giving up the power. The idea that an intelligence service, police force, a prime minister, a president can listen to the conversations, get the text messages, see the photos of their rival, a journalist who doesn't like them, some annoying NGO worker, or whatever it may be. No one wants to give that up. No one. And I'm not saying that regulation is impossible. I think it is possible. But at the moment, the European Union kind of flirted with some regulation, but it got nowhere, is the long and the short of it. So what you say about Brazil sadly did not shock me, because I've seen it in literally dozens of countries. And the record in all those other countries is it's almost certain there'll be little accountability for the fact that it happened.